Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session, The Influence of the Prophets on Contemporary Liberal Jewish Values, led by Rabbi Alexandra Wright. It's lovely to have this opportunity to introduce my colleague, Alex. She's ordained at Leabeck College in 1986 and has then served LJS as the junior rabbi before becoming the sole rabbi of Radlett and Bushy Reform Synagogue, now Radlett Reform, and she ministered to that congregation for 13 years. What I forgot to say to people is please put yourselves on mute. Thank you. So she ministered at Radlett for 13 years before being appointed as senior rabbi at the LGS in 2004. I can't believe it's as long ago as that. The first female senior rabbi in Britain, a position she continues to hold. And Rabbi Alex was actually appointed as president of Liberal Judaism a few months ago, which is a wonderful, another first. And amongst her extra congregational commitments, she's co-chair of British Friends of Rabbis for Human Rights and an active contributor to Interfaith Dialogue. There's much more I could say, but the most important thing to say is that she's a keen cyclist and tries to cycle to most places on most days. And as she puts it, not always successfully in extreme weather. Well, this evening, we've had loads of extreme weather, but this evening we're all cozy here, probably most of us in our homes, and we're looking forward to hearing from Rabbi Alexandra Wright. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Thank you. And lovely to see so many of you here this evening. Thank you very much for coming to listen. I want to begin by saying that in some ways, the subject of the prophets and their influence on contemporary liberal Jewish values is quite a contentious subject. Why? Because they raise the subject not only of faith in one God, and our faithfulness to the covenant with which the prophets were concerned, but because they're concerned with bringing about change in the individual, but also in the community, in the social fabric of society. The prophets, as I'm sure you all know, express, among many other things, moral outrage, indignation at what they see to be wrong in the world. They attack kings and priests, the elite, the wealthy. They attack cronyism, self-indulgence, greed, exploitation, trafficking, slavery, corruption, fraud, and so on. And their message, I don't need to spell out to you, is timeless. They speak to us today, but so easy to be attacked for meddling in politics, as the prophets were attacked themselves, getting involved in the abuse of power, in the abuse of prosperity. And that seems to me highly contentious in today's world, particularly for religious leaders who have to be very careful about how they use the pulpit. And just from a personal point of view, sadly, on more than one occasion, people have walked away from my synagogue because, as they said, rabbis should keep out of politics and stick to religion. But equally, I have to say, on occasions when I think I've been highly political, addressing issues of contemporary relevance, the results have been surprising. One of the most political sermons I think I gave resulted in somebody going off and founding the LJS drop-in for asylum seekers. So things can go both ways in that respect. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I will try and keep an eye on the time. And I would like to take you through it because it will tell you exactly what I'm going to do tonight. Can everybody see that? Yeah, good. The influence of the prophets on contemporary liberal Jewish values. I'm going to, this is the contents page. I'm going to look at the primacy of ethics in Judaism. And we're going to look at just 3 statements, I think, of our founders, not Lily Montague, interestingly. I probably need to do a bit more research on that, but Montefiore and Mattock, and then later on John Rayner. And I will confess to you that I've drawn very heavily on Rabbi John Rayner's Principles of Jewish Ethics, which is a booklet. If you don't know it, I don't know, Tom, whether Liberal Judaism still stocks copies of it. It's an invaluable booklet, not huge, but it's a wonderful, wonderful resource on this subject. I'm then going to sort of ask you what you think the scope and major themes of Judaism's ethical principles are. So just start thinking about that. You know, what are the themes and issues that that Judaism is concerned about? If we've got time, I'm going to look at a prophetic vision of how the world could be from one of the prophets. We'll see if we have time for that. We probably won't have time to look at all 3 prophets, whom I've listed here, Amos, Isaiah, and Micah. But we will look at one, and really, in some ways, just to look at one in greater depth, I think will be better. And I'm very happy to share the PowerPoint with you after this session as a PDF. And finally, I've asked the question, or made the statement rather, why liberal Judaism must have a voice in the political sphere. So forgive me if I do sort of bit of reading here, just to sort of set the scene. This is a passage from an essay by Claude Montefiore from the Hibbert Lectures, from a lecture by Claude Montefiore. He says it was the prophets, men few in number but great in power, who gave to the religion of Israel its specific character and direction. He talks about the origins, really, of its character through Moses, Samuel, Nathan, Gad, Elijah, Micah. Then he goes on to say, the harvest was gathered, or rather it was ripened, by the prophets of the 8th century. Amos, 1st Isaiah. It was they who definitely connected the worship of God with the practice of morality and conceived the idea of a holy nation, divinely chosen and divinely trained. They were the first to show how the triumph of a nation's God, his veritable day of glory, might be signalized by his people's punishment and defeat. And this is the bit that I think is important. It was the prophets who purified the conception of the Eternal One as a God of righteousness and naught besides, and began the transformation of the only God of a single nation into the God of the entire world. So here he's talking about monotheism, one God, one universal God. But the word I want to concentrate on here is righteousness, and we'll come back to that in this presentation. Here is Rabbi Dr. Israel Mattock talking about social justice. And in this passage, he's talking about the social responsibilities, both of individuals and the collective obligation of society. So in other words, not only our own personal responsibility, our own personal ethics, but the ethics of that social fabric of society. It's much larger than an individualized ethic. It's a social ethic which is conceived in collective terms, communities, societies, nations, international relations, and so forth. And this is John Rayner, who I think, always expresses himself with such clarity he says Judaism is many things, but most fundamentally, it is an ethical monotheism, the world's oldest. That is to say, it teaches that the universe owes its existence to a single creator who is a God of righteousness, justice, love, compassion, and forgiveness. And these attributes also describe what God requires of us. What does the Eternal One, our God, require of us? The Eternal One is righteous and loves righteous deeds, says the Eternal One. I won't read all of this, but he takes this verse from Isaiah. Rabbi John Rayner takes this verse from Isaiah: the Eternal One of hosts shall be exalted in justice. The Holy One of Israel, sanctified in righteousness, is a verse which we sing throughout the High Holy Days. I'm sorry, this is what Heschel says, forgive me, on this verse, and says, this is a staggering assertion. Why should his justice be the supreme manifestation of God? Is not wisdom or omnipotence a mode of manifestation more magnificent and more indicative of what we associate with the divine? It would have been more plausible to declare the Lord of hosts is exalted in majesty. The Holy One of Israel is sanctified in omnipotence. Omnipotence is an attribute which no mortal shares with God, while justice is a quality to which human beings too lay claim. It is a quality devoid of sublimity and mystery, elementary and undistinguished. Now, I think there's some sort of rhetorical device going on here that Heschel is using, but nevertheless, it's a provocative question. You know, why not speak about God's wisdom or omnipotence in that verse? Why, or majesty? Why his justice? Which should make us think really carefully about the nature of Judaism. I'm moving fast, I'm afraid, and this is my first question for you. And I'll stop sharing just for the moment here, but so that you can have a think about it before we move on. So you might just want to unmute yourselves one by one, or put in the chat, which I will try to look at, what you think is the scope of prophetic Judaism's ethical principles. Now, I mentioned some of those in my introduction, but I want you to think about the kinds of issues, subjects that might be covered by the prophets. That's that not just the whole of that middle section of the Hebrew Bible that begins with Joshua and ends with Malachi, but I'm thinking really of the great literary prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, what they call the 12 minor prophets that begin with Hosea, include Amos, Micah, Joel, Obadiah, Malachi, and so forth. I mean, they're called minor, not because they were minor prophets. There's nothing minor about Hosea or Amos or Joel. They're called minor because their books are shorter than Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And these are the literary prophets. So those are the questions. They're the same question, really, just to sort of clarify what areas of our lives might prophetic Judaism have an influence over. So let me just stop for a couple of minutes here. Whoops, I don't want to give away too much. So it might be easier, Tom, if we just go to galleries so that I can see if anybody's got their hands up. What areas of our lives, either personal or collective, national, community, might the prophets, if you're shy, just put something in the chat. Environment, thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, definitely. Justice, equality, great answers. Anything else? Inclusiveness, yeah, to be inclusive. Think of your sort of haftarot on Saturday morning, tikkun olam. I don't think that's, yes, absolutely. I don't think, Ellie will tell me, that it's a phrase that comes in the Bible. Can absolutely, Ronnie, is it? Concern for the weak, the poor, the orphan and the widow, social interaction. These are excellent answers. They're all absolutely right. Thank you, everybody. Wonderful. Keep those coming. And I will go back to sharing my screen here. And let's have a look. Let's have a look and see. So each of these subjects in our personal, whether it's personal ethics, is substantiated by a verse from the prophets, as you can see here, in most cases. So truth is one issue in terms of our own personal ethics. Social ethics, you talked about inclusiveness and equality, substantiated by this very famous verse from Amos, "Are you not like the Ethiopians to me?" God says to Israel, to the northern kingdom, "You're no different from the Ethiopians. Didn't I bring another people up from a place, and I brought you up from Egypt?" Poverty, how dare you crush my people and grind the faces of the poor, from Isaiah. So as somebody put in the chat, poverty, obviously, how we are with those who are vulnerable. Family ethics, this famous verse from Malachi, which we read as a haftarah just before Pesach on Shabbat Hagadol. Elijah will turn the hearts of parents to their children and the hearts of children to their parents. Family reconciliation. Education is also about ethics. Economic ethics, pay and issues around that. Wages of a hired servant, that's Leviticus, shall not remain with you all night until morning, because if you hold on to the wages of your hired servant, then what are they going to be able to buy their supper with? Where are they going to sleep? How are they going to find somewhere safe to spend the night? So these are some. Let's go to the next page. Further scope on human relations. Media ethics, that's a very contemporary issue. But again, as Malachi says, the law of truth was in his mouth. You know, what happens when you corrupt the truth? What happens when libel takes place? What happens when there are aberrations within the media? It's a very complex area, which I'm no expert on. Legal ethics. Justice shall you pursue, Tzedek, Teodof, again, Deuteronomy, but these are themes which are picked up by the prophets. Political ethics, how you are in the city where you live. This is Jeremiah's very famous letter to the Jewish people in Babylon after the exile. Seek the well-being of the city where I've exiled you. Pray to God on its behalf, for in its well-being you will find your well-being. And in a way, you know, our prayer for the royal family emerges out of this verse. Yes, you're part of the city in which you live. You need to pray to God on its behalf. And political in terms of equality, then he shall judge the poor with equity and decide with justice for the lowly of the land. Justice shall be the girdle of his waist, talking about probably here a messianic king figure, messianic sovereign figure who will preside over the land with justice. Environmental ethics, as somebody mentioned here, a very famous verse from Isaiah 11:9, they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, from Isaiah again. And of course, these verses are very much used when we speak about contemporary issues to do with the environment, to do with the poor. Going on then, from human relations to social relations, the fabric of society, of communities, peace, nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Treaties, if you like, international treaties, communication between nations, turning away from war. Public policy, law and order, employment, economic, medical. In other words, government policy influences for good or ill the behavior of members of society towards one another, and therefore the collective ethos. Race legislation. Here we've got Genesis, but in a sense you could say that Genesis underpins the whole of prophetic literature. On that day, God created human beings. God created them in the divine image. And I present the Amos verse, which we had before, a little diffidently, because I don't think this is about race in the context of the Bible. But of course, we read the Bible through many different prisms of interpretation. But I don't want us to think, because there's a whole different argument about race in the Bible, and whether there is, there's certainly anti-idolatryism, if I could put it like that. But I think the question of race is very different, particularly in this verse and in other places where it might look as though the Bible is talking about race. But I don't think it's an issue in the way that we see racism as being an issue. I think there are other enmities for Israel in the Bible. Distribution of wealth. Now, that's the Deuteronomy verse, but of course the prophets, Amos and Isaiah among them, are really very concerned with poverty and the crushing of the poor. Government. So I should really pause to give you time, but I think what I'll do is just press on for the minute and then come back to your comments and questions at the end. So these are the things that I have pulled out, really. There's so many different themes with which the prophets are concerned. But these are headlines, if you like. All human beings being created in the divine image, and therefore to be treated with the respect, love, consideration, and sensitivity to which they are for that reason entitled. Freedom, justice, we've talked about, compassion, a united humanity. Have we not all one divine parent? Has not one God created us in the prophet Malachi, the last of all the prophets? Peace, they will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. They will sit under their own vines and fig trees. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Environment, hope. There's lots about hope, for I'm mindful of the plans I've made concerning you, plans for your welfare, not for disaster, to give you a future with hope. And of course, it's very obvious to say, I'm not saying anything original here, far from it, that all these headlines, these major themes, are issues which concern us today. They're absolutely uppermost in our minds. little picture of the synagogue and the church. The synagogue blindfolded, turning aside. The church victorious here from Strasbourg Cathedral. Now, this is these are verses from Isaiah, from either second or third Isaiah. You know, Isaiah is at least two separate authors who we call first Isaiah, lived in the 8th century, and second Isaiah or Deutero-Isaiah, who lived probably lived in the 6th century during the time of exile, towards the end of the time of the Babylonian exile, and maybe even just after the return to Zion. And some people say that there's a third Isaiah from chapters 56 onwards to the end. So this may come from third Isaiah. But I'll just, let's just have a look, and you might want to ask yourself again, what are the themes? And you can put in the chat, please feel free to put in the chat, what are the themes that emerge from this Isaianic prophetic vision of the future? Behold, I'm creating a new heaven and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered. Never again shall be heard there the sounds of weeping and wailing. No more shall there be an infant or greybeard who does not live out his days. They shall build houses and dwell in them. They shall plant vineyards and enjoy their fruit. They shall not toil. They shall not toil to no purpose. They shall not bear children for terror, but they shall be a people blessed by the Eternal One, and their offspring shall remain with them. The wolf and the lamb shall graze together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox, and the serpent's food shall be earth. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. So when we think about, as liberal Jews, how we build a society based on social justice, we go back into the prophets and ask ourselves, what are the fundamentals within the prophets, within just a few verses that we've just looked at there, that create a society that is based on social justice?
And Alex, would you like people to respond by putting their hands up and also by using the chat?
Probably better in the chat. I can see some more things. Chesed, speaking truth to power, people. What about sexual ethics? Thank you very much for that. Yes, we'll come to that. I've got an example of that. Definitely sexual ethics. Speaking truth to power, chesed, live in harmony and accept each other as we are. And David Goldberg, these are all aspirational and far from the world we live in today, yesterday. A vision of some of the old ways of doing things are to be transformed. Yes, Elizabeth, thank you. A vision of what we aspire to in messianic times. Care for one another, the land we share. Yeah, all of these things. Yes, and they are aspirational, and maybe we can talk about this, but how do you affect change? If you have an ethical basis, if you have a theological basis, that's another matter which perhaps we can talk about at the end, to what extent we need a theology in order to affect change, because change requires very, very deep roots. It's not something that you can just make happen without planting the seeds and without making sure that the roots are very, very firmly planted. So just here, well-being, caring for children, giving them the best start in life. And I think that's very relevant for us today when you think about what provision is there for the very young, for example. We used to have Sure Start nurseries. what do we have that supports families, that give children their best start in life? No more shall there be an infant who does not live out their days. Caring for people in their old age, social care, housing, big issue for us today. It's not like the post-war world where 500,000 houses were built in every year. We struggle to build enough housing for ourselves today, for our population. Work. I'm just listening this evening. Well, there's so multiple issues which we can talk about. Of course, I've taken verses and I've used them with a little bit of license here, but they force us to think about contemporary issues. Peace, of course, another really topical issue. Climate justice and sustainability of the earth. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain. And I'm kind of stating the obvious here, so I apologize, but I really think it's good to have a real structured look at what is it that gives liberal Judaism its strength and its influence. And these are ideas that go back, nearly 3,000 years, more or less, 2,800 years. So we're just doing quite well for time, I think, Ellie. Am I going too fast?
I think it's fine. I mean, you might want to pause and ask if people have got a question.
Let me pause there, perhaps, for a few moments, and give you a chance to make some comments or add things like the sexual ethics. I have an example of that. Very good question, Kathy. Originally my title was not Liberal Judaism, it was Judaism, but I was asked to focus on Liberal Judaism by the organizer. So that's why it's Liberal Judaism. But thanks for the question. Originally, the title that I offered was more general. Any questions? Any comments? Have I missed anything in the chat?
I think that David has got a question.
Yes, it's all wonderful, Alexandra. I agree with every one of these sentiments and statements. And one that was a favorite of mine in court over many years was Deuteronomy. And I would say to judges and juries, justice shalt thou pursue. It's great. Doesn't always happen, though. And the problem with all of these things is they are sentiments, necessary, valid, important, to be preserved, to be repeated, all of that. But to make them happen, climate change, COP27 is an example. They couldn't agree on something so fundamental as the preservation of the world we live in. The world may vanish because of the absence of the ethics that we are talking about. You cannot enforce these things. It is so frustrating, so agonizing. Just to listen to the news today that the Russians bombed a maternity hospital and killed a 2-hour baby, a 2-hour-old baby.
2 days old.
2 hours old.
Day.
2 days. I don't know.
Anyway,
2 days or two. A newborn baby. Horrific. It's absolutely horrific. And do these people have any ethics? Do they care about these ethics? Can we inculcate any kind of sense of these ethics into these people? And that's what we have to do. You're talking to the converted.
Of course I am, that I know, and I absolutely. And then the question is, how then do you promulgate this structure of ethics? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a better question. Well,
you know, because
Say that
it
Elizabeth
wasn't-
Storrs has a question as well.
Yeah. Yeah, Elizabeth, is it about feminist Jewish ethics? I think, I mean, I would defer to Rabbi Eli here, but I think for a feminist, I think that in as far as the prophet, we were going to concentrate on the prophets. I would look at sexual ethics here, which I mentioned that I would come to and mention in a bit later on. But of course, another way of the prophets are a specific literary genre that is not a narrative, really, unless you have a parable like the parable of the vineyard, the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah chapter 5. It would be quite difficult, but I'm saying this in a guarded way, to elicit a feminist ethic from the prophets, from narratives, you know, in Genesis, in Exodus, maybe in Numbers, in the book of Ruth, in the Song of Songs, in other books of the Bible. Yes, I would definitely use feminism as an interpretative way of reading those texts. I don't want to be black and white here. I don't want to be dogmatic about this. But when you think about the role of women in the prophets, I'm thinking about Hosea particularly. Hosea is told to marry a prostitute. And his marriage becomes a symbol for the unfaithful relationship between God, between the Jewish people and God. And the offspring of those marriages are given names that speak about God's rejection of Israel because of their immoral behavior and their idolatry. How do you read that in a feminist way? You know, that's the prophet that I think about, where the role of women is quite prominent in some way. That's a challenge. I need to think about that. If you're familiar with the book of Hosea, it's quite a complex sort of rhetorical way of going about talking about the relationship between God and Israel. I suppose another way, I would say that you have a kind of feminist theological way of interpreting parts of Deutero-Isaiah, who uses different images for God, different metaphors for God, different names for God, including, you know, a woman in labor or a mother. So there are theological terms that are female that Deutero-Isaiah uses. I'm trying to think about other. I mean, Amos attacks the wealthy women who lie on their couches, as calls them cows of Bashan. So I'm interested to hear whether any of you, I can see, I think Dodo's made a comment, God as mother, yes. These are theological ways of talking about God. But on the feminist ethic about how we are with women, how do we treat women? I mean, certainly women as a vulnerable, the widow, certainly she's there very much so in Isaiah and in other prophets. Are there any other suggestions, comments on that?
I just want to say a word about that we can put different texts together. We mentioned sexual ethics, and reading "You shall love your neighbor as yourself" as broader than just a generic kind of love, but how we treat one another as in a mutual, reciprocal way, and that we do bring our sort of feminist lens not only to things that are specifically about women, but to texts which may have not be saying anything about gender at all, but we're thinking about, you know, there are lots of statements that are implicitly about equality. But I do think we have a problem, don't we, with the prophets being, well, particularly, as you say, Hosea, being just incredibly misogynist, actually. That's
Yeah,
bluntly.
I agree. I don't think women come off terribly well in the prophets. What about Dodo? You put your hand up.
Yeah, the parable in Hosea, if you are a little bit brave and you put it upside down, the prophet is the woman and the prostitute is the man. You get a completely different story.
You invert them.
What would happen then with the story?
Yeah, you could do that.
Just a suggestion.
Certainly. I want to go. Can I go back to David Goldberg? Your question about, you know, all these are very nice sentiments, but can we have a look at one of the prophets, just Amos, to see what are the struggles that he's dealing with? Because maybe his world wasn't so very different from our own world. You know, he's not uttering these things as sweet sentiments. He's wanting to bring about change, and he's willing to express moral indignation and outrage about them. And the prophets suffer because of that. And maybe, you know, they weren't cowards in any way. They weren't afraid of attacking the king. They weren't afraid of attacking priests. They weren't afraid of attacking other nations and then turning on their own nation to criticize. And maybe we're just too diffident. Maybe we go along with the, you know, maybe we think about these things, but maybe we don't put ourselves out there in the way that these lone voices like Amos and Isaiah and Micah did. So if we could just have a look now at Amos and see whether we can take some courage from him. So his twin themes really here are the condemnation of social and political ills in society. So where is he? Here he is. He was born in the southern kingdom of Judah. This is, of course, post-Solomonic, after the division. I'm assuming a lot of knowledge here. After Solomon, Israel divided into two nations, the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel. Amos, born in the southern kingdom, but preached to the northern kingdom. A near contemporary of first Isaiah and Micah here, these two in the southern kingdom. Jeremiah we're not going to talk about here. Just a little bit about his life. People think he was a kind of humble dresser of sycamore trees and herdsman. He was probably had his own farm, you know, we don't know. Maybe he was quite wealthy. Comes from, there he is with his herd there. And the prophets, as I mentioned at the beginning, take their stand on two really essential ideas. One, that there's a covenant between God and Israel. And the second, that the covenant binds the Israelites to a completely ethical relationship, one to the other. And this comes up again and again, this idea of the Brit. So there's his birthplace. He's preaching in a time of material power and prosperity, and Israel is sort of elbowing itself and encroaching on Judah. Of course, Israel and Judah are a sort of strip of land lying between the great empires of Assyria, which was weak at this time, and Egypt in the south, which I haven't mentioned here. and the king is Jeroboam II. And again, you know, it's a time where the elite are interested in accumulating their own wealth. One of the things that's most striking about Amos is his sort of glancing around to the surrounding nations. Gaza here, Tyre, we'll see over the page, lulling the northern kingdom into a kind of complacency. Oh, well, we're all right, Jack, because Amos is having a go at other nations around about us. So we're okay. But then he suddenly, with real ferocity, turns on Israel itself to criticize them. And we see again some of the themes that Amos addresses: violence and forced exile, because they exiled an entire population. Gaza, these are his oracles. Thus said the Eternal One, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, for 4 I will not revoke it. And again repeats this: for 3 transgressions of Tyre, for 4 I will not revoke it, because they handed over an entire population to Edom, ignoring the covenant of brotherhood. The Ammonites, violence, real horrendous violence, torture, greed for their own territory, warfare, slavery and trafficking, abuse of women and other vulnerable people. Here's where he rounds on Israel, on the northern kingdom now, because very famous verse from Amos. It's the Haftarah for Parashat Vayeshev, the first parasha that deals with the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery, thrown in a pit and sold to the Midianites or the Ishmaelites, because they have sold for silver those whose cause was just, and the needy for a pair of sandals. I mean, it is extraordinary language, this. He is angry. He is outraged by the way that the elite and the wealthy crush the heads of the poor into the dust of the ground. And here, I think, very interesting, father and son go to the same girl. I mean, this is a kind of sexual ethic here that some of you were mentioning before, and thereby profane my holy name. So I think this is what's so interesting about the prophets, and that is totally irrelevant in our own time, and is a problem, I think, is that this covenantal relationship that we have with God is profaned and violated and abused when human beings behave immorally and unethically. You cannot unravel the two. And for the prophets, that is absolutely consistent right the way through all prophetic literature. And we have untied the relationship between theology, if you like, and ethics, between what we believe and between this covenantal relationship with God. I don't just mean within Judaism, I mean within the social, within society as a whole. We have nothing by which to pin our ethics onto, which is why ethics becomes something that's so individualized. Anything can happen. Fraud. His condemnation here in these verses of the wealthy. When Amos appeared in the north, there was pride, plenty, splendor in the land, elegance in the cities, might in the palaces. As he says, I will smite the winter house with the summer house and the houses of ivory. This image of wealth and exclusiveness shall perish, and the great houses shall have an end. You that put far away the evil day and cause the seat of violence to come near, that lie upon beds of ivory and stretch themselves upon their couches and eat the lambs, etc., out of the flock. This is where he attacks these wealthy women, the cows of Bashan, that oppress the poor, that crush the needy, that say to their lords, bring that we may feast. They don't know how to do right. Again, more condemnation of the way they treat the poor. They build houses of hewn stone. They're summer houses, but they don't dwell in them. They're holiday homes, if you like, that just lie empty all year round, while the poor sleep out on the street and have nowhere to live. So there is also this sense of helplessness in the prophet, you know, this sort of inviolability of the wealthy. Heschel says, what had provoked the anger of the Lord? What had happened to shatter his silence? Two things stand out of the prophet's condemnation: the absence of loyalty to the covenant and the absence of pity. Very powerful, I think, in the way that he expresses that. This whole section is really a familiar area of discussion, which I'll just pass over, I think, in order to leave some time. His whole discussion around ritual versus ethics. Of course, Deutero-Isaiah also deals with that, you know, with the famous Yom Kippur, Haftarah, Isaiah 58, is not this the fast that I have given to you, you know, to bring the homeless into your homes, and so forth. So there's a lot here about ritual versus ethics. I'm sure this is familiar to you. I don't want to see any of your songs. I don't want any of your rituals. I need you to live in a moral, ethical way. Amos talking here about equal rights, which we've spoken about already, about justice. Harsh is God's intolerance of justice, but the gate of repentance remains open. Amos does not question God's justice. He appeals to God's mercy. And I'm going to just leave Isaiah, more of the same, really. And I'm going to leave also Micah. You can see those themes that he speaks about. And just sort of coming to the end of this, I just sort of end with this very famous verse from Micah. He has told you, O man, what is good and what the Eternal One requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness, to walk modestly or humbly with your God. Then will your name achieve wisdom. This wonderful distillation of a sort of universal ethic, really, here, about justice, goodness, and humility. And here I just want to end by saying, really, why I think that religion must have a voice in the political sphere, even if it, you know, I don't think there's a separation between politics and religion, where I'm not talking about party politics, where politics is concerned with ethics, with morality. Many of the prophets spoke against the backdrop of political turbulence, international crises, violence, crime, accumulation of wealth, fraud, deep divisions between rich and poor, corruption of leaders, cronyism, greed, and corruption. And in that sense, the prophetic world and the prophetic voice are timeless, and that message speaks to us today. The prophet was sensitive to what was wrong in society and wasn't afraid to speak out against what he saw as the social ills around him. He addressed the twin issues of prosperity and power, corruption, when these things were abused. So, Kathy, of course, why Jewish prophetic values must have a voice in the political sphere? They are Jewish prophetic values. They're not just liberal Jewish. because the prophets show great empathy and compassion for the vulnerable and weak in society. And when the prophets speak about injustice, it makes us ask them, what is the opposite of that injustice? What is it that we would want to cultivate in our society? This sense of rigorous kindness, the preciousness of interpersonal relationships, respect for morality and righteousness. And this great question, I think, I don't know about great, but this question is, how necessary is faith, which of course can also be divisive, in creating a society based on justice and righteousness? And how do we corral our movement or our communities and in order to express our moral outrage at what we see wrong with society and with its leadership? We haven't even begun to talk about immigration or the asylum system or carting people off to Rwanda, but I don't need to mention those to the group of people who are here, because in talking about forced exile, I know you're thinking about those issues. And this is the question that we come back to your question, David. How do we bring about change in the social fabric of society? And I don't have the answers to that, except to say that I think that the resources that the prophets give us are deep and immense, and that we need to go back to them again and again and again, and draw on them and take our courage from them. We lived 2,500+ years after these individual prophets who demonstrated much greater courage, perhaps, than we do. And that is the end of my presentation. With not much time. You're muted, Ellie. Ellie, you're muted.
I thought I unmuted. Sorry. I just want to thank you very much, Alex, for your excellent presentation. And obviously, we're going to take a lot of things away with us. We don't have the time here, but I hope that question about how we bring about change is something that we will reflect on, particularly at a moment when we've got the World Cup and issues being raised directly with Qatar, for example, and how teams are responding. The England team decides to do one thing, the German team decides to do something else. Which is the better response? They're going to be people who are more activists than others. But if somebody's got a burning question they would like to ask before we close, please do ask it. I'm just looking to see. We've got a new message. Hold on. I can't see that we've got a question there. Anybody would like to ask a question before we end? No? Okay. Oh, yes, Robin. Do you like to unmute yourself?
Oh, I just typed in to please share the PowerPoint presentation so we could, go back and reference it.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. Do I send it to Tom, or where do I send it to Tom? Is that, yeah?
I think send it to Tom, yeah. Well, it just leaves me then to say thank you very, very much. You've given so much food for thought. And by presenting that power presentation, you've enabled us to actually visually read those things and take them in even deeper from just listening to words. And the way you organize the material has really helped us to think about the connections between past and present. So thank you so much. And everybody will, I'm sure, look forward to receiving that material and taking it forward. So, yes. Congratulations, much appreciated.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you for coming.